How are baseline respiratory rhythms set and modified? Here we will examine some of the factors that control and regulate respiratory rhythms and breathing rates. There are three factors that control respiratory rhythms: neural controls, so that is structures in the brain that are controlling breathing rates, hormonal controls, and reflexes. Here we will explore some of the neural controls. There are two main sites in the brain that contain clusters of neurons devoted to setting and controlling breathing rates: the medulla oblongata and the pons, both of which are located in the brainstem. In the medulla, there are two clusters of neurons. One is referred to as the ventral respiratory group, and the other is called the dorsal respiratory group. In the pons, there is a cluster of neurons that is referred to as the pontine respiratory center. So the ventral respiratory group, located in the medulla oblongata, is the group of neurons that set and control the baseline rhythm for breathing rate. This neuron group sets what is called unia at 12 breaths per minute. This is the baseline breathing rate. This group of neurons signals the diaphragm and the external intercostals through the phrenic nerve. The dorsal respiratory group uses sensory feedback from CO2-sensitive chemoreceptors in order to modify unia. So we will see shortly that it is the concentrations of CO2 that are the primary stimuli for setting and modifying respiratory rhythms. So the pontine respiratory centers also function to modify the baseline rate set by the ventral respiratory group. The pontine centers smooth the transition between inspiration and expiration, and also fine-tunes breaths during speaking, sleep, and exercise. Chemical factors have the biggest influence on the neural controls of breathing. There are three primary chemical factors: the partial pressure of CO2, the partial pressure of oxygen, and the pH of the blood that all control respiratory rhythms. The partial pressure of CO2 has the largest influence on neural control of breathing. So as such, there are specialized sensory structures called chemoreceptors that detect changes in CO2 concentrations, detect changes in oxygen concentrations, and also detect changes in pH. Chemoreceptors that are located in the brainstem are referred to as central chemoreceptors, while the chemoreceptors that are located in the aorta and the carotid arteries are referred to as peripheral chemoreceptors. So since the partial pressure of CO2 is the primary chemical stimulus that controls breathing rates, let's examine it first. So when the partial pressure of CO2 rises, we see that blood pH drops. That is, it becomes more acidic. So recall that a decrease in pH means that the environment is becoming more acidic. And in response to this, breathing rate is increased, as well as depth of breathing is also increased. This helps to remove more CO2 from the blood during exhalation. So as arterial CO2 concentrations rise, we see that the pH of the extracellular fluid in the brain starts to become more acidic as a result of that. The centrochemoreceptors in the brainstem control most, roughly 70%, of the ventilation response to the increase in CO2 concentration, as well as the decrease in pH. So these chemoreceptors signal the medullary respiratory centers, particularly the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group, which can then communicate with the muscles of respiration, so like the diaphragm and the external intercostals, in order to increase ventilation rates as well as depth of breathing, which causes more CO2 to be exhaled with each breath, thereby decreasing the concentration of CO2 in the arteries. So when the partial pressure of CO2 drops, the blood pH increases. That is, it becomes slightly more alkaline. In response, breathing rates are slowed and the depth of breathing is also decreased, and breathing therefore becomes more shallow. What this is accomplishing is that it is allowing CO2 concentrations to build back up to a baseline level, as the bloodstream is never completely rid of all of its CO2. So we see that a drop in CO2 concentrations in the bloodstream causes what's called apnea, and apnea is a temporary stoppage of breathing when the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood drops to abnormally low levels. So somewhat confusingly, as important as oxygen is to our body, the influence of the concentration of oxygen in the bloodstream only has a mild effect on influencing ventilation rates. The nervous system centers that control breathing rates are more concerned with the CO2 levels than they are with the oxygen levels. we see that declining partial pressures of oxygen generally do not affect ventilation very much because it turns out there's a huge reserve of oxygen bound to hemoglobin, even when we are exercising. So even at our most active, our hemoglobin never comes close to releasing all of its bound oxygens. Oxygen concentrations do become a major influence on neural respiratory centers when the arterial partial pressure of oxygen drops to less than 60 millimeters of mercury. So typically we see that arterial partial pressures of oxygen are about 100 millimeters of mercury. So therefore, if it drops to about half of what it should be, that is when oxygen becomes a major influence on breathing rates. Chemoreceptors for oxygen are located in the carotid and the aortic arteries. These chemoreceptors also detect CO2 levels, but as we just saw, 70% of the respiratory response to CO2 comes from the central chemoreceptors that are located in the brainstem. We also see that higher brain centers can control and sometimes override the respiratory rhythms and patterns that are generated by the brainstem. One of these higher brain centers is the hypothalamus, which is located in the diencephalon of the brain. The hypothalamus is a major site for the control of homeostasis, so things like body temperature, blood pressure, etc. Some of the neurons in the hypothalamus are part of the limbic system. The limbic system is one of the emotional response centers of our brain, and the limbic system controls our physical responses to emotions, so like increased breathing rate, increased heart rate, and things like that. So for instance, the hypothalamus is what prompts us to hold our breath when we are angry or when we are in pain, and it can also change breathing rates as body temperature changes. Still, other higher brain centers like the cerebral cortex give us the ability to consciously control our breathing rates. So for instance, one can voluntarily hold their breath. Eventually, the brainstem will reinstate normal breathing rates when the CO2 levels in the arteries rise.